Well, thank you very much, Ray, and buenos días. Estoy muy contento de estar con ustedes en Cancún. And that's all I will subject you to, but thank you. I really enjoy being here today. My daughter is fluent in Spanish, but I am not. So thank you for inviting me. I'd like to give some really, that's my disclosures, but I'd like to give some practical tips about creating a research database. Obviously, we can't cover everything today, but I'll just pick a few highlights that I think will be very useful as you move forward in your research careers. As Ray mentioned, we started HCV Target in 2011, which was designed to understand the impact of new hepatitis C therapies that were utilized in usual clinical practice at both academic and community centers. And we developed a unique partnership between academia, industry, the FDA, and community sites as well. And HCV Target's been going strong. It's still ongoing. We've enrolled now actually close to 13,000 patients. The data has been used in many different publications, and it's been cited in many different hepatitis C treatment guidelines around the world. The organizational chart is shown here. And I just show this because it kind of illustrates an important point. So I run at UNC, I run the Data Coordinating Center, and my co-principal investigator, Dave Nelson at the University of Florida, runs the Clinical Coordinating Center. And what this shows is, one, it can be a little bit of a complex undertaking. You see all the different facets that go into running a very large, and this is actually an international study. We have running about 60 sites in the US and about roughly 5 or 6 sites in Europe. But it also stresses the importance of collaboration. So Dave Nelson and myself have worked together for now 8 years just on this study alone. We have many good people who work with us, and nobody can do it by themselves. So throughout this discussion, I'll stress about the importance of collaboration and identifying the right members of your team. But first, let's talk a little bit about planning. And you can see this. I don't know, guys. Something just doesn't seem right here, okay? So this, again, illustrates the point that before you plunge into doing a study or trying to create a research database, thinking about it in advance and certain key points that you have to keep in mind. So some of the things that we want to think about are, what are the scientific questions that we want to try to answer with this database? Is this going to be a focused, very specific question that you're going to try to answer, or are you doing it longitudinally, long-term, where it's very open-ended and allows you to do longitudinal data mining and answer many different questions over the course of years. And that's really how a Target is designed, to do longitudinal, open-ended study design questions. Who will have access to the data? So it's important to kind of think about a governance plan for the data, particularly when you're thinking about multi-center studies. Develop data use agreements. How will patient privacy be protected? Mauricio talked today about some of the ethical and legal concerns about that. And of course, everybody's very focused now on patient privacy and making sure data is not indiscriminately distributed. Even simple things like how are you going to collect the data is important. Are you just going to use paper and submit that to a central database? Can it be web-based? Are you going to download it from existing systems that you already have, or some kind of hybrid model? Think about what would work for the type of study you're doing, for the types of centers that you're collaborating with. And then how will data quality be assured? And we'll touch on a few of these points as we move forward. So as you're thinking about a research database, there are a lot of key personnel that you have to collaborate with. And everybody brings a little something different to the table. And you may have seen that cartoon of if a blindfolded person touches one end of the elephant, they're only going to think about what the trunk looks like or what the tail looks like. But together, you can really build a very nice, creative database that can really move your research forward. So clinicians, of course, are the people who are going to be identifying the patients and entering the data along with their research teams in the upper right corner there. So you want to make sure that it's conducive to them being able to do that. If you make things too complex, no one's going to want to participate. The IT specialist is really the key person who's going to help you program the database and develop all the data entry tools that you need. Of course, the statistician needs to have access to the database to be able to extract the data and put it into some other type of programming that they can use to do some of the statistical analysis plans that we heard from Arun. And then we usually have like a project coordinator who kind of oversees this whole orchestra of people and tries to conduct everybody moving in the same direction. So all of these people bring really critical pieces to developing the database. I would say if you're thinking about starting a database, the first thing you think about, of course, is you heard from Arun, the research question that you're going to try to answer. Once you have that, you're going to try to then think about what kinds of data do you need to collect to answer those questions. And you'll create a data dictionary. And I think about this initially as a wish list. In a perfect world, if I could collect all of these pieces of information, this is how I would do it to be able to answer that particular question. And it can consist of things like patient characteristics, like all the different kinds of demographics, the particular disease you're studying, how they stage the disease, for example, and longitudinally over time. Patients' comorbidities, and this gets into what Arun was saying about the confounding factors that you may have to consider when you're thinking about whether your intervention is actually working, or what you have to consider as you're analyzing, doing subset analyses. So what kind of comorbidities, what kind of concomitant medications people are taking. You may want to be able to collect patient-reported outcomes. This is a hot area now in patient-oriented research, getting information directly from the patient on how they're feeling while they're on treatment, how the medicine is improving their quality of life, for example. You may be able to collect that within your research database. Biosamples. Are you interested in doing translational studies? You're developing a very rich data set, very detailed data set over time. Imagine if you have a biosample linked to that data set, how strong that could be. DNA, serum or plasma, even now the microbiome, stool samples, for example, how strong that kind of those samples could be linked to clinical data that then you can use for translational studies, collaborating with a basic scientist, for example. So again, perfect partnership between clinical scientists and basic scientists to do translational studies. How your intervention is affecting the patient in terms of adverse events or serious adverse events. And then how things are changing over time, laboratory data and various outcomes over time. So in a perfect world, you'll think about all the things you would love to collect. But in reality, it's a little bit more challenging than that, because we also have to think about feasibility. And feasibility is a balancing act, really, between what you would love to have in your database and what you could really actually collect. And you have to ask yourself, every time you're putting in a new piece of data, do we really need to collect all that data? Will that data ultimately help me move the answer to my question forward? Or if it won't help you move it forward immediately, will it be important later on as you're trying to do data mining then? So some data you collect now, you may not need immediately, but it would be very useful to have in the future. So that would be important. So you have to kind of prioritize what data you're going to collect, because there's a cost in time and effort for every data point that you collect. So you have to make sure it's really worthwhile for the overall conduct of your study. So then you take this data dictionary and you say, okay, well, in demographics, right, what are some of the key ones? Of course, you've never read a scientific paper that has not included age, sex, race of the patients that you're studying, right? That clearly important demographics. But then do you need their hair color? Do you need to know whether or not they're left-handed or right-handed? Well, maybe you are studying something that makes a difference in that regard, but in general, probably not. Education level, insurance status, markers for socioeconomic status may be important as you think about confounders. So again, all these kinds of things you take into account as you're building your data dictionary. And then if you're not doing things like patient-reported outcomes, biosamples, all of that adds a lot of complexity to collecting things, and again, adds to the cost and the time commitment involved in the individuals participating. So you create that first wish list and then narrow it down to think about what do you really need to do that. And after you do that, then you think about what data platform might be useful. And I'm going to focus on something called REDCap. Any of you here have databases up and running or do research and maybe use REDCap or some equivalent? So, yeah. Okay. So REDCap, the good thing about REDCap, it was developed by Vanderbilt University. The good thing about REDCap, it's completely free. So anybody who's working in academic centers has open access to using a very powerful database. So, and if you look at they have a map on the REDCap data website about where it's being used all over the world. So it would be a perfect opportunity to utilize a free, very powerful database with a lot of built-in tools that you can utilize for your own research programs. It started out pretty simply, just doing data collection, but later expanded into clinical trials. And I'll show you some of the functionality that it has. It's 21 CFR Part 11 compliant, which I'll talk a little bit about, but that has to do with the data standards, the standards for electronic data capture, which regulatory agencies are very interested in. You can customize it, and you can do longitudinal studies. And actually, our HCV target study, and actually our other target studies that we're doing are all actually utilize a form of REDCap that we've modified to some extent, although the basic platform is still there. So REDCap is a secure web-based application, and it allows you yourself to create these electronic databases for any kind of research projects, small research projects, just a few patients, or like I showed you, 13,000 or more research subjects. It's quite powerful. You can enter data directly online, or the data can be fed in. You can do automatic downloads. So remember, the database is there just to capture all the data. But then you have to take that data, and your statistician has to be able to utilize that in some kind of other program. So REDCap, you can download that data very easily into things like Excel if you're creating charts or graphs or anything else. But also you can download it into statistical packages that your statisticians will want to use. So SAS, for example, are things that are very commonly, that we commonly use, and most statisticians are familiar with all the ones that I showed you there. It has a scheduling module. It has some reporting tools, and it also has some advanced features that we'll talk about. But with REDCap, so you can build an online data collection forms very quickly and securely. You don't need any extra software. You can access your data from any computer, really, even handheld devices, okay? You can generate customized reports. You can have multiple users. So think about a multi-center study, or even within your own institution, if you're doing a single center study, everybody can have access to it without paying any additional licensing fees or anything else. It does comply with IRB requirements. It complies with privacy requirements, et cetera. And there's also some auditing features in there. We'll talk a little bit about data quality. Now, something as simple as how you enter the data, you even have to think about. So there are two prime methods that you could, well, in terms of if you're not using free text, for example, and I don't recommend using free text, get away from free text as much as you can. But as an example, think about two ways you might be able to enter data. One of them is called radio buttons. And think about, and I actually just looked this up. I didn't know where the term came from, but the term came from those old-time radios. If you remember, I don't know, many of you may not remember this, but you press a button, the other buttons pop out. So you can only press one button at a time to get to your station. Do they still have those anymore? I'm not even, maybe, no, they don't. Okay, sorry. But that's a radio button. So that would be if you have several choices and they're all mutually exclusive. Yes, no, maybe, or red, white, yellow, blue, and you only want someone to pick one, you would use a radio button. But if you want them to potentially check off a lot of different things that they may have had in the past, in this case, prior second-generation treatment, they might have had several others, you can do checkbox fields. And the reason why it's important to think about this up front is for two reasons. One, the person entering the data, it can be easier to do a radio button if they only have one choice. Or though some questions where you have to do checkboxes or give them multiple options. But also, even exporting the data it can affect this. So for example, a less sophisticated data manager can do their own queries when there's only a few choices. Whereas if you have to do multiple choices there and see what's mutually, how they all fit together, you may need a more complex program to pull that data out. So even how you enter the data in the first place has to be something that you think about. And REDCap can do a whole bunch of things. I highly recommend it. It's on the web. You can just search REDCap. It's Vanderbilt University. And it's pretty simple to get you started. And there may be some online tutorials and things like that can get you. But it allows you to put in all different kinds of text fields. If you want to put in dates, you can do calculations, right? So if you're calculating BMI, or you want to calculate time of entry to the time of their first dose of a particular medication, all those things can be built in. Pretty much anything you can do in Excel, you can also do in REDCap. It also, you can apply branching logic, which as you get more complex with your database, you can ask the question, does this patient have characteristic A or B? And if the answer is yes for A, then B disappears, and then you start focusing on additional sub-questions for characteristic A that may be important to the study that you're doing. You can upload files to it, so if you have pictures that you want to upload and link to the patient, or patient-reported outcomes that you want to link to the patient, you can upload those and directly link them together. And then you can also put in some data checks, which helps with data accuracy. If you have someone manually entering data and they put in a hemoglobin value of 280 grams per deciliter, it'll flag it and say, hey, did you really mean 280? Or should be 28 or 18, as the case may be. So again, REDCap has a lot of different useful features. You can also integrate some special dictionaries to even make it more powerful. So if you're thinking about doing clinical studies and you want to understand more about adverse events that may occur, or even trying to describe a patient's past medical history, again, thinking about the confounders that you have to think about in the future. There are some standardized dictionaries that you can incorporate into a data dictionary into a database like REDCap. And MEDRA is one good example of those. This is actually free for academic institutions as well. HUDRUG, which is designed to standardize concomitant medication reporting. Unfortunately, that's not free. But it's very important because if you enter one medication, if you spell the medication wrong in your data field, then when you pull the data out, it's going to be wrong, and it's not going to get grouped into the correct medication. So by having a built-in standardized dictionary, you can actually eliminate a lot of different coding errors and make sure that the data is consistent. And these two are very standard. They're used in most phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials that you're doing with pharmaceutical companies, but you can also have access to them as well. So I would highly recommend, if you're doing longitudinal clinical trials, that you think about trying to incorporate some of those. The other thing is that data quality is important, right? You've always heard this term in garbage in, garbage out. Well, here's a cartoon. Use the CRS data. It's based on the market size. Well, that data is wrong. Okay, then use this other database. Well, that data is also wrong. Well, then average them, okay? And he goes, okay, well, we can also multiply them. But of course, the data is wrong. No matter how you cut the data, it's going to be wrong. So data quality up front is very important. In Target, we have a lot of built-in measures that we focus on data quality, and not all of them may be relevant to you, but there are a couple of things I do want to mention, because again, as you build larger databases, this becomes very important. I'll talk a little bit later about monitoring data, okay, because that's important. What somebody enters isn't always the same as what's actually in the source document, so you often will like to have a third party comparing those two things to make sure that it's really accurate. In the lower left, well, first on the lower right, I think it's important that you keep your study documents all up to date, and this also has to do with the IRB regulations and ethical regulations. So you need to have document controls and making sure that everybody has been trained appropriately. All of this goes into data quality and the importance as you're creating research databases. On the lower left, I'll just mention a couple things. 21 CFR Part 11, CDISC compliance. I talked about MEDRA and HUDRUG coding there. Let's talk about CFR Part 11. I know that you may have an equivalent here in Mexico, but what this is, at least in the US, it's the standard by which the FDA accepts electronic data capture for clinical trials. So you're vouching that the signatures are trustworthy, reliable, that the way the data has been captured in a certain way meets all these standards, and it's called 21 Code of Federal Regulation Part 11. REDCap is 21 CFR Part 11 compliant. So in other words, just as an example, if you enter data, it'll flag when that data was entered, and it keeps an electronic record of that. If someone goes in and changes the data, it actually keeps an electronic record of when someone changed that data. So again, you can't just go in and arbitrarily change the data that you don't like. It's keeping a sort of a track record of all the changes that are happening with the data. And again, just goes to data integrity. And REDCap has this already built in, and I see that you have some, here in Mexico, some federal personal data laws that I'm sure you're much more familiar with than I am, but all of this goes into the concept of data quality as you're building your research database. Thinking about whether or not you're going to exchange the data up front is also important as you're building a database. So, for example, in the US, we have, and actually this is globally, the Clinical Data Interchange Standards, CDISC. You know, we often hear, let's say one investigator is doing a study in Mexico City on a particular disease, and then someone else in Guadalajara is doing a study on a similar disease. And that person has 500 patients, this person has 1,000 patients. You say, hey, why don't we get together and merge our data, and then suddenly we'll have a really huge data set that we can analyze much more effectively. Well, it's not that simple, because how this person labeled their variables may be very different than how this person labeled their variables. And from personal experience, we have tried to combine various databases, and it is a nightmare. It takes almost as long as restarting the whole data collection process. So if you think about up front, using this kind of data standards, then it will be much easier to collaborate with other investigators around the world and even share your data with, in our case, federal agencies like the FDA that utilizes these kinds of standards. So that's something, again, to think about up front with building a database. Even just the simple things of naming the variables in a consistent way that can be used across multiple investigators. Data monitoring touches on why databases, creating databases, I think is really important. Traditional methods of data monitoring really had a monitor travel to a site. So if you were doing a multi-center study, that monitor might have to travel to 100 different sites over time. And they would rely on 100% source verification. They would take the case report form that a clinical research coordinator filled out. They'd compare it to what's actually written in the medical record from what was developed during that patient being evaluated for that clinical trial, as an example. And it can identify data entry errors, it can identify missing data, it makes sure that the study documents are really there. But it's really costly, it's time consuming, and the manual efforts may actually introduce other errors by themselves. So one of the things that they're getting into now is this risk-based data monitoring. This is kind of a more recent iteration of data monitoring. And this is really endorsed and encouraged by many regulatory agencies, including the FDA. It utilizes a centralized monitoring system, and what it does is, instead of monitoring everything, it identifies key things where you need to have 100% verification. So for example, informed consent documents, right? You want to make sure that every patient, you heard this from Mauricio, every patient has consented. So that might be one element that you're going to make sure you know that every single patient signed their consent form appropriately. You're going to make sure that they met the eligibility criteria to be into the study, because again, that's where the confounders come in. If they don't meet, if they have a lot of different confounders that weren't taken into account for the eligibility criteria, it's going to affect your outcomes measure. And then there may be some certain effectiveness or endpoints or safety endpoints that you get monitored. So the database, you can build in certain edit checks, and this is where I gave the example about entering an abnormal hemoglobin. That study coordinator or data entry person enters it, and it'll flag it immediately and say, hey, that can't be correct. Recheck it, so you're not putting in garbage in the first place. But also, interestingly, you can also do these statistical analyses across many sites and identify some anomalies. So for example, if you have 20 sites participating in the study and the median number of serious adverse events that gets reported at a particular site is, say, 1.4, at all the sites is only about 1.4%. So only 1.4% of people have reported a serious adverse event with the drug that you're administering to them. And you have two sites. One has an SAE rate of 1%, but then another site has an SAE reporting rate of 8.5%. Right? That pops out to you. Why does this site have 8.5 times more than every other site in our grouping? So this is where the idea of risk-based monitoring, the risk here being that there's what are they doing differently? Are they reporting them differently? Is everybody else not reporting them enough and one is over-reporting? Or is it a patient population that is just so at the far end of the spectrum that you're getting more SAEs? So this is where risk-based data monitoring come in handy, not those red flags. Okay. Querying the database has to be user-friendly, and this gets to, again, collaboration. And here you have the investigator, Bob, talking to his data manager. So how do I query the database to get the information? Well, the data manager can't even agree on calling it a database. Well, it's not a database, it's a key value store. Oh, it's not a database, but how do I query it? Well, he gives him some ridiculous answer about writing this new program that he needs. So Bob goes, well, did you just ask me to go screw myself? And I believe it, Bob. So anyway, it's really important that you have to query that it's very user-friendly, that you're all working together, all on the same planes, because, again, we want to publish data. The only way you can get the data out is by making sure that it's simple to use and that all the team is working together. And then finally, I'm just going to close with aligning incentives, because, again, in collaborative studies, this is really important. I showed you why it's important to collaborate. But all collaborations begin with the best of intentions. Everybody wants to work together. But if they're not managed well, these can deteriorate. So if somebody's doing all the work and getting no resources, that's not a good long-term relationship. Might work for a little while, but not long-term. So in funded studies, it is important to compensate co-investigators to support their staff and time. But money isn't just all of it, okay? That may only be a small part of it, because maybe these aren't even funded studies. What I really think is critical, particularly for investigators, is the academic capital, okay? And that's often more important. And that's upfront establishing a publication policy so that all collaborators can participate in writing abstracts and manuscripts. And that even includes the statisticians and everybody else, all critical members of the team, okay? All together, if you look at all the big multi-center studies, they're often, they have dozens of authors. That may be a little too many, and depending on how big, sometimes you have more authors than patients in the study. You got to watch that. But short of that, you have to find some happy balance. So you want to distribute recognition to all the co-investigators for this academic capital. And as an example, in HCV Target, we've had more than 100 unique co-authors across a lot of the presentations and publications that we've done. So just in summary then, involve multiple team members in planning, investigators, data managers, regulatory specialists, statisticians. I mentioned about the open source databases such as REDCap. I highly recommend you starting to investigate that. It is relatively easy to build. I even built a few simple tables myself, and I am not a database specialist. Feasibility is critical. Tailor the data collection to research questions that are likely to be answered and be meaningful, but also try to incorporate what may be meaningful in the future as well. You don't want to make it too restrictive and then have to start all over again. So that happy balance with feasibility. Focus on the data quality, automated data checks, risk-based monitoring plan, try to think about. Align the incentives, and again, encourage collaboration. So thank you very much, and I'll stop here. I'm happy to take any, I don't know if we have any time, but I could take a few questions if you do. Thank you.